My name is Erwin Chemerinsky. I'm Dean and Distinguished Professor of Law and Raymond Pike Professor of First Amendment Law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. The Fair Housing Act was adopted in 1968, not long after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It was adopted in light of the reality of tremendous race discrimination in housing throughout the United States. This took many different forms. Many different institutions were responsible for the discrimination with regard to housing. Banks were part of this, local governments were part of this, the federal government with its lending practices were part of this. There were restrictive covenants, there were zoning ordinances, and what the Fair Housing Act was meant to be was a comprehensive approach to deal with the problem of race discrimination in housing in the United States. It was written in broad language, and it was intentionally meant to have a broad effect. The evidence seems overwhelming that banks were engaged in what are called predatory lending processes. Banks were targeting especially African Americans and Latinos who were economically vulnerable in giving them very undesirable loans. The loans were structured in a way that it was quite likely they'd ultimately be foreclosed. And that's what happened. In cities across the country, banks targeted vulnerable individuals, especially people of color, and gave them loans that led to foreclosures. The Fair Housing Act makes it clear that any practice that has the intent or the effect of discriminating based on race is illegal, and it seems clear that the banks were doing exactly that. Tremendous harms have been experienced by cities as a result of these practices by the banks. Once the property was foreclosed, it often lays vacant. Cities have to use their resources to deal with this. These are resources that are taken away from things that provide for all city residents. So this isn't just about helping low-income residents in a city. This is about helping all residents of a city who are adversely affected by the predatory lending practice of the banks. Ultimately, the cities want to stop the banks from engaging in predatory lending practices that harm especially African Americans, Latinos in cities, harm low-income individuals, and harm all residents of the cities. And of course, the cities want to recoup some of the costs that they've incurred as a result of the illegally, racially discriminatory practices by the banks. I wish it were so that discriminatory lending is old news. As the lawsuits against Miami and so many other cities show, banks continue to engage in predatory lending practices. The reason these lawsuits are so important is they're all about stopping the banks from continuing to engage in discriminatory lending practices. For years, banks engaged in what was called redlining, refusing to give loans to individuals of color who wanted to move into white areas. What these lawsuits are about is how, in essence, banks have engaged in reverse redlining, targeting African Americans and Latinos with these predatory loans, knowing there was a high likelihood of default, and then foreclosing on the property. In 2015, the Supreme Court reaffirmed that the Fair Housing Act prohibits practices that have a discriminatory impact. Acts by banks, by government entities, by real estate agencies that have a racially discriminatory effect are prohibited. It seems so clear here that the banks were engaged in predatory lending practices that at the very least have a discriminatory effect against African Americans and Latinos. If these suits are allowed to proceed, then similar suits in cities across the country can go forward. In the long term, this is how we're going to stop predatory lending practice by banks. In the shorter term, help cities recoup some of the costs that they've incurred because of the illegal practices by banks. Race discrimination is not a thing of the past. We are not a post-racial society. What these suits are about is how banks intentionally targeted African Americans and Latinos with predatory loans. There have been enormous costs to cities across the country as a result of these practices by banks. I think this is such an important civil rights issue. I was really honored to be involved in it from the beginning, in the case in Miami and other cities as well.